My name is Immani, and I used to think I had built the kind of life that people envied at 39. I had a powerful job in finance, I had two beautiful children, a warm and elegant home in a sought-after Atlanta suburb, and most importantly, I had given my parents a place to live when they had nothing left. I had bought the house outright in cash, a 6-bedroom, 5,000 square foot property with a rose garden, a chef's kitchen, and enough space to make anyone feel safe and welcome. I had done all that while raising Zoe, who was 10, and Marcus, who was 8, and while managing the daily chaos of high-stakes markets and brutal schedules. I had done it all thinking I was finally earning the kind of respect and love I had longed for my entire life, especially from my mother Lorraine and my father Joe. But that illusion shattered one night when I returned home after a long, exhausting 12-hour day of work. I was expecting the usual chaos, maybe my children arguing over a cartoon, or laughing in the hallway, the sound of feet pattering, or something silly playing on their tablets. But when I stepped inside the grand foyer at exactly 9 o'clock that night, all I heard was silence. Not peaceful silence, but an emptiness that echoed off the marble floors and crept into my bones. The refrigerator hummed in the distance, but my kids were nowhere to be heard or seen. And something about that absence pulled the breath from my chest. I dropped my briefcase on the floor and called out, "Zoe, Marcus, Mommy's home," but the house remained still. Then I heard it, a faint noise, soft and broken like a muffled whimper. And it wasn't coming from their rooms upstairs, it came from somewhere lower, from beneath me. I rushed toward the basement door, my heart pounding as I swung it open and ran down the steps, and what I saw made me feel like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. Zoe and Marcus were curled up together on a bare mattress, a spare guest mattress thrown onto the cold tiled floor of the unfinished basement. They were surrounded by piles of their belongings, toy boxes, bags, suitcases, Marcus's tub of Legos, Zoe's plastic drawers of art, supplies, all lined against the damp cement walls, as if someone had dumped them down here like trash. The basement was musty. It was not meant for anyone to sleep in. It smelled of mildew and dust, and the air was heavy and cold. I could see their breath rising in the air. Zoe looked up at me, her cheeks wet with tears, her nose pink and swollen, and she whispered, "Grandma said we had to sleep down here. She said Leo needs our room." My stomach twisted as I knelt beside them and pulled them into my arms. Marcus was shaking, his voice barely whisper as he added, "She said we're too noisy and Leo is the real grandson and he needs peace and quiet, and our room is better for him. She moved our stuff while we were at school." I held them tighter. I kissed their foreheads and told them not to move, that I would be right back. My rage was not loud. It was not fiery. It was cold like steel. I stood up and walked up the basement stairs, my steps loud and sharp. I went straight past the main level and up the second staircase to the children's wing of the house. Their room was at the end of the hallway, and when I got there, I stopped and stared at what had become of it. The door was wide open, but the space inside no longer belonged to my children. The twin beds were gone, the walls stripped of the glow in the dark stars, and Zoe's colorful drawings, Marcus's blue rocket curtains had been replaced with heavy gray drapes, and where the beds once stood was now a king-sized bed with a luxurious comforter. A giant television I had never seen before was mounted on the wall, and a brand-new gaming console was plugged in, wires trailing like vines across the polished floor. And in the middle of the bed was my nephew Leo, 9 years old, jumping up and down with his sneakers still on, shouting and laughing like he owned the place, and standing beside the bed, her back to me, humming as if she were preparing a royal guest room, was my mother Lorraine, 63 years old, always stern, always convinced the world owed her something. She was unfolding Chris sheets with care, Mom, I said, my voice steady despite the fire inside. She didn't even flinch. "Oh, you're back," she said without turning around. "Your sister, Alicia, and Chad are staying here for a bit, and I'm getting Leo's room ready. He needs a space that is calm and quiet." I took a breath and forced myself to speak without screaming. "You moved Zoe and Marcus out without telling me." She turned, finally frowning a little, but still calm. "You need to stop overreacting. They're children. They don't need a fancy room to sleep in. They'll be fine in the basement." She said this as if it were obvious, as if the idea of tossing my kids into the basement like unwanted guests was logical. She added, "You're nearly 40. When are you going to stop being dramatic and start showing some respect? I am your mother, and this is my house, my house." Those words struck something ancient and painful inside of me, and in that moment my rage didn't rise, it settled. I stopped shaking, I stopped breathing hard, and I became something else. I remembered being 18, coming home, holding my college acceptance letter for a top finance program, one of the few black students in the state to win a full ride. I had run home thinking, finally maybe she would be proud. I had burst onto the porch to find her chatting with the neighbor, and when I handed her the letter, she barely glanced at it and said, "Affirmative action is powerful." And then, without even blinking, she told me I had better learn how to make real money to take care of the family, not just sit around reading books. Now, 21 years later, in a house I bought with money I earned in an industry I had worked tooth and nail to break in, she still saw me as someone who owed her and who would never be good enough. I turned and left the room and walked calmly down the stairs back to the basement where my children were still sitting shivering on that cold mattress. I knelt beside them again, wiped Zoe's cheeks and brushed Marcus's curls, and I told them, "It's okay, pack your things, the Legos, your drawing supplies, everything, we're going somewhere better." And behind me I heard Lorraine's footsteps. She had followed me, and she stood at the bottom of the stairs, basking in what she thought was her victory. She said to my kids, "See, your mom understands now. I told you, Grandma knows what's best for this family." I ignored her and spoke only to my children, softly, clearly. Lovingly, she heard me tell them to pack, and that was when her tone shifted. Her smugness broke. "What do you mean?" she snapped. "You're leaving. Because of this, your sister is arriving. You're going to make a scene." I turned to her, smiled the kind of smile that has no warmth, and I said, "Oh, I'm not going anywhere, not tonight anyway, but you, Mom, you are going to learn what it feels like to have nowhere to go, and very, very soon." She blinked, her expression twitching from arrogance to confusion to a creeping fear. And then the doorbell rang, sharp and echoing through the house. Alicia had arrived with Chad, and the show was about to begin. I took a deep breath before leading Zoe and Marcus up from the basement, their little hands clutching mine, as we stepped into the bright silence of the main floor. And as we reached the top, the sound of the front door bursting open echoed like thunder through the foyer. And there she was, my younger sister Alicia, 2 years younger than me, but carried like she was royalty, her expensive sunglasses still on her face, even though it was dark outside. And behind her came Chad, her husband, dragging, not carrying, but dragging 4 massive designer suitcases across the hardwood floor, leaving long pale scratches that made my stomach turn. My father, Joe, who spent every Saturday polishing and buffing those floors, flinched, but as usual said nothing. Alicia swept into the house with a dramatic sigh and threw herself onto the velvet couch like she was a queen returning from war, her voice loud enough to fill the entire first floor as she said, "God, that flight was brutal. Immani, are you just going to stand there, or are you going to grab the rest of the bags? And can someone please bring me a glass of wine?" She still hadn't looked at me. She was more interested in inspecting her nails. Chad, meanwhile, gave my father a hearty backslap and said, "Joe, what a place, man, this is incredible. I told Alicia your folks would take care of us, no problem." My mother, Lorraine, was already fluttering around her youngest daughter like a desperate bird, chirping, "Oh, my sweet baby, you must be so tired. Yes, Immani, go get sister some wine, don't be rude." And Alicia, from her reclined position, added in her shrill voice, "Mom, is Leo's room ready? Did you remember the HEPA filter? You know, he cannot sleep without that. And the mattress, you got the new one, right?" And my mother smiled proudly and nodded, "Of course, baby, only best." Just like I promised, I watched this absurd display of arrogance and entitlement all unfolding in the house I bought. And then I spoke the words, falling quiet and sharp from my lips. "The best room." Everyone stopped speaking and slowly turned toward me. Alicia finally looked in my direction, and her eyes trailed down to Zoe and Marcus, standing close to my legs, their faces pale and tear-stained. She saw us standing in front of the basement door, and a grin spread across her face, the kind of grin I had seen all my life right before she did something cruel. She said, "Oh, there you are, this is perfect. You and the kids are in the basement. That works out great. And then she laughed that ugly short bark of a laugh and said it's basically soundproof, right, Mom? At least Leo won't be bothered while he's studying. You know how brilliant he is, and he needs peace and quiet. I looked at her, the golden child. The one who had dropped out of not one but two colleges, the one who couldn't hold down a job longer than a few months, who had failed at every single thing she ever tried, and I let out a short dry laugh that stopped her mid-grin. Study, I said, and she blinked. What's funny? I walked into the living room with my children still beside me and said it's just that the last time I heard anything about Leo studying, he had just been expelled from his overpriced private school for selling other students their own Adderall prescriptions. Alicia's face turned white. My mother gasped and shouted, "How dare you!" But I ignored her and looked directly at Chad, still standing like a smug statue beside the couch. So how long are you two planning to stay? Or is this the new forever term of living rent-free in someone else's house again? Tell me, Chad, what happened this time? Did the NFT project for custom dog sweaters collapse again? Or was it the crypto startup about vegan bacon and blockchain? I honestly can't keep up. Chad's smile vanished, and Alicia's eyes widened with panic, and for a moment the air in the room thickened into something electric. Chad tried to laugh, a stiff robotic sound, and said, "That's a little harsh, Immani. We're just between transitions right now. The market's a bit tight, and we just needed a soft place to land for a few months. That's all." Alicia, sensing her husband flailing, did what she always did. She played victim. She threw herself into our mother's arms and said, "Mommy, she being mean again. Look at how she talks to us. I thought we were family, and she's acting like we're strangers." She pointed at me with one trembling finger and said, "You're so rich with your big job and this massive house, and you can't even share some of it with your own sister and your parents." My mother snapped toward me, her eyes blazing with a kind of fury I had only ever seen when she was defending Alicia. She screamed at me, "Immani, you shut your mouth right now. Your sister is in trouble, and you will help her. This house is big enough for all of us, and God knows you've been living here free long enough." The words stung not because they were true, but because of how blatantly false they were. I could feel the memory rise uninvited the night 2 years ago when the phone rang at 2 in the morning, the storm outside shaking my windows, and I answered to hear my mother sobbing hysterically, saying, "Immani, we lost the house. They took it. The bank took it. Everything's on the sidewalk." I had sat up in bed, confused and terrified. "What foreclosure? You paid it off years ago." And then I heard my father's broken voice. "It was Chad, honey. We gave him our savings, our retirement. We took out another mortgage to help him." I had jumped out of bed that night, driven in the storm for 3 hours to their old house, and found them sitting on a soaked mattress under flashing lights with their things ruined by rain and pity. I brought them back to my apartment, gave them my bed while I took the couch, and a week later I used every cent of my 6-figure bonus and my entire savings to buy this house for them, so they wouldn't be homeless, and not once did they thank me. And now they stood here, calling me selfish, calling me ungrateful, telling me I lived for free in a house I bought with my blood and bones. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, but like a clean break. The last tether of hope I had in ever being enough for them severed, and I looked at Alicia, who was now whispering in my mother's ear, and Chad, who had gone from smug to calculating, and I said, "I'm not rich, Alicia. I'm just financially literate. Maybe you should try that sometime." Chad stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger, and said, "Listen here. You need to stop with that attitude. You think you're better than us. But I know people in your industry. I know how you finance folks, hide money. You think I don't see what you're doing with your little tricks. I could make a call to the IRS, have them comb through your records, and maybe take a closer look at your custody too. Would you like that?" I stared at him unmoved and asked, "Are you threatening me, Chad, a financial analyst with a clean record and strong security clearance? Are you suggesting I'm committing tax fraud in my own home, where there are high-resolution audio cameras in at least 4 rooms, including this one?" The color drained from his face, and Alicia stepped back and whispered, "What Chad say?" Something. My mother tried to laugh and said, "She's bluffing. We live here. There are no cameras." I said, "Oh, Mom, that's just what I wanted you to think." And with that, I turned around and took my children by the hands and walked them down the hallway into my office, the room no one was allowed to enter, and I closed the solid door behind us and turned the lock, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to breathe. Inside my locked office, the chaos outside faded into a dull thudding rhythm, fists pounding on the heavy wood door, voices overlapping in rising waves of panic, rage, and desperation, but none of it touched me anymore because inside my office I had created a different world, a world where my children were safe, curled up on the leather couch, their headphones on, their eyes fixed on their tablets, watching their favorite movie, while I sat behind my oak desk, my chair tall and steady beneath me, my monitors dark, for now my mind focused as sharply as a surgeon before an incision. The lock on the door felt like a shield, a final boundary between me and them, between the woman they thought I was and the woman I was about to become. Outside, the voices kept calling my name. Chad shouted, "Immani, you coward, open the door right now." Alicia screamed something high-pitched and broken, full of fake hurt. Tantrum, my mother Lorraine was the loudest, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury. She screamed that I was disrespectful, that I was mentally unstable, that I had no right to treat them this way. She shouted that I owed her, that everything I had was because of her, and she demanded I open door this instant, but I stayed still, breathing in the silence I had carved out around me. I picked up my phone calmly and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed, David. He was my property attorney, a man who had helped me draft every agreement I ever needed, including the one I was about to pull out of the shadows. I hit call, and after a single ring he answered, David speaking, his voice crisp and warm. "As always, David, it's Immani," I said, my tone calm and professional. "I need you to send me a file right now, the one from 2 years ago. You'll remember, it was the rent-to-own agreement I had you prepare for my parents. I need a copy with their digital signatures, fully executed, please. Highlight section 12, subsection B, regarding guest policies and room assignments on the premises." I heard a brief pause as he registered the urgency, then said, "Of course, I'll have that sent over in the next few minutes. Is everything all right?" I glanced at my children, who were still immersed in their film, and said, "Everything is just business as always, David, nothing more." He understood without asking more, and I ended the call. Outside, the banging intensified. My mother screamed that she needed my credit card, that Leo could not sleep on Zoe's disgusting mattress, and that I had to pay for the new king-sized one immediately. She kept yelling that my daughter's mattress was filthy, and that her precious grandson deserved better. Her words sliced through the door like shards, but they did not reach me anymore. They floated past my ears like meaningless static. And then I heard the most beautiful sound, a soft ping. My inbox had a new message. I turned on the screen, opened the email, and there it was, the document, clear, precise, legal, a file I had buried beneath politeness and obligation, now glowing in digital certainty. The agreement between landlord Immani K. Davis and tenants Joseph and Lorraine Davis, signed, sealed, and binding. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, walked to the door, and unlocked it, the sharp click echoing like a judge's gavel on the other side. The shouting stopped, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that comes right before a storm. I pulled open the door and faced them all, my mother standing front and center, her face twisted with indignation behind her, Alicia with her arms crossed, her face smug, and Chad with his hands on his hips, trying to look dangerous. My father Joe stood at the back, his shoulders slumped, his eyes refusing to meet mine. Lorraine marched toward me, shouting about mattresses and Leo, and how I had to fix everything right now. She raised her hand to demand again, but I cut through her words with a single sentence, "No, Mom, I will not be paying for that mattress." She froze. "What did you just say?" I said. "No," I repeated, standing firm in the center of the office. "And this is not your house, and it never was." They stared at me, frozen like statues, as I stepped back into my office, my children still quietly watching their movie, and I turned the monitor outward for all of them to see. A large clear PDF opened in full screen, and at the top it read, "Landlord Immani K. Davis, tenants Joseph R. Davis and Lorraine M. Davis." I pointed to the signature block at the bottom, time-stamped and legally binding. "My lawyer is very thorough," I said. "You both signed this 2 years ago when you moved in. Do you remember the rent-to-own plan? The executive housing program," I said, "was backed by my company. That was a lie I made up to preserve your pride. There was no program, no tax clause, no financial cover. I bought this house with my bonus and liquidated my stock to do it. I bought it in full, and I let you live here for free out of love, out of duty, and all I asked was that you never bring chaos into my children's lives, and now here we are, you allowed Alicia and Chad to throw my kids into a basement to sleep on a cold floor so their cousin could have a flat-screen television and a new mattress, and you never even called me, so now we deal with this legally. I scrolled to the next highlighted section, which reads Section 12, subsection B. Tenant agrees not to allow any other persons to reside on the premises beyond 48 hours without written consent of landlord, and furthermore agrees not to reassign or repurpose any designated rooms assigned to the landlord's children, Zoe Davis and Marcus Davis, for any other purpose without consent. I read that aloud, slowly letting every word weigh on their heads. I said, as of 9 o'clock this morning, when you moved their bed into the basement and gave their room to Leo, you are in violation of the terms of this lease, and that violation is material and incurable. They stood in stunned silence, my mother's face turning pale. Alicia looked outraged, but said nothing, and Chad, who was still processing all of it, stepped forward. Wait, so this house, it's not connected to your parents' assets, it's not part of any shared trust. I ignored him and looked at Lorraine. No, Mom, it was not a gift from you. It is not a shared legacy, it is mine, and it always was. Your name is not on the deed, nor on the mortgage, nor on the utilities. You are tenants with no authority, and now you have breached the contract. Alicia finally exploded, pointing at me with shaking hands. You lied to us, you pretended to be one of us, and you bought all this behind our backs. You think you're better than us. I smiled coldly. You never asked, you just assumed you owned what I built. Chad, however, was not angry. He was calculating. His face shifted from shock to something colder, something strategic. And he said, wait, if it is in your name, then nothing stops you from evicting them today, right? But if you do that, then you will look like the villain to the community. You will lose face, your church, your friends, your reputation. I see the play here, you bluffing, but you can't actually do it. And then before anyone could say another word, the doorbell rang loud and sharp again. I turned and walked away past all of them as they stood there staring at the glowing screen behind me, and when I opened the door I was greeted by two delivery men in red company uniforms, one of them holding a clipboard, and behind him on a dolly was a king-sized mattress wrapped in plastic. He looked confused. Good evening, ma'am. We have a delivery for a Mrs. Lorraine Davis. She ordered a Royal Legacy king-size mattress. Total comes to $3,274 with tax and delivery. Lorraine shouted from the hallway, that's mine, bring it in. But the man hesitated. He looked from me to her, unsure. I stepped forward. I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake. This woman is not authorized to make purchases at this address. She is a tenant, and she has no financial control of this property. I am the homeowner, and I did not authorize this delivery. Lorraine marched forward, her voice high with rage. What are you doing? Stop embarrassing me. Pay the man now. I kept my eyes on delivery guy and said firmly, she will not be paying because she has no account, and I will not be paying because this was not my purchase. Please remove this item from the property. The two men, clearly disturbed, nodded quickly and began rolling the mattress back toward the truck. Lorraine lunged toward them, shrieking, no, that's for Leo. Stop it. You can't take it away. But they did. The truck drove off, the door closed, and I turned back into the house, leaving my mother standing pale and trembling in the entrance. The tension that lingered in the house after the mattress incident was like a storm cloud refusing to move away. It hung heavy in the air, pressing on everyone's chest, and even though no one spoke of it directly, it changed the entire mood. My mother barely looked at me that night. Instead, she shuffled around the kitchen, muttering to herself as she cooked something that smelled burnt and bitter. My father sat quietly in his recliner, flicking through the channels on the television, but not watching anything, and Alicia was glued to her phone, whispering to Chad in fast, low tones, while Leo ran wild from one room to another like nothing had happened. The next morning, I woke up early. I could not sleep anymore, not with my thoughts spinning around me like a cyclone. I made breakfast for my kids, who were unusually quiet. Zoe stared into her bowl. Marcus picked at his toast, and neither of them said anything until Marcus finally asked, Mama, are we staying here, or are we leaving? I looked him in the eyes and said, we are not leaving, baby. No one is throwing us away ever again. That seemed to reassure him, and he gave a small nod while Zoe reached across the table and held my hand without saying Word after breakfast, I stepped outside onto the porch to get some air. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in soft orange light, and I could hear birds in the distance. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel calm, to pretend like this was just a normal day. But then I heard the front door creak open and footsteps approach behind me. I turned and saw my mother standing there, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She said, "We need to talk," and I nodded silently, following her into the living room, where my father, Alicia, and Chad were already seated like they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. My mother gestured for me to sit, and then stood in front of us all like a judge about to deliver a sentence. She started speaking in that clipped, sharp voice she used when she wanted control. She said, "Immani, we all think you overreacted yesterday. You embarrassed us in front of strangers and your father, and I feel like you have forgotten your place." I blinked slowly. My place was in the kitchen, in the background, in silence, according to them. But I did not speak. Yet she continued, "You used a legal document against your own family. Who does that? How dare you treat us like tenants after everything we have done for you?" My father nodded silently. Alicia looked smug, and Chad leaned back with a smirk, like he was waiting for the next move. I said nothing until she finished. Then I stood up, walked over to the bookshelf, and pulled out a box of files I had kept for years. I opened it and took out old bills, medical receipts, school invoices, rent checks from the apartment I paid for my parents in 2008, utility bills in my name, grocery receipts from years ago, times when they had no money and I stepped in to keep the lights on. I dropped them on the coffee table one by one with deliberate care, and then I looked at all of them and said, "You think I forgot my place? Let me remind you of my place. My place was paying the rent when you lost your job, Dad. My place was driving across town at midnight to pick up Alicia when she was stranded with a drunk boyfriend. My place was taking Leo to the doctor when Alicia could not afford his copay. My place was giving you every inch of stability you stand on right now, and I never asked for anything in return, not even respect, until now. So do not talk to me about place, Mom, because I know exactly where I stand." And then I turned to Alicia and said, "And you called me, stuck up behind my back for years, told people I was selfish, that I thought I was better than you. But every time you were evicted or fired or broke, who did you call, and who showed up every single time? Me. And yet the first chance you got, you gave my kid's bedroom to your son like they were trash, like they did not matter. And you expected me to take it quietly. Well, I will not, and I never will again." Alicia's eyes narrowed, but she did not argue. Instead, my mother stepped in again, her voice rising with desperation. "You are making this harder than it needs to be, Immani. We are family. We can work this out. You do not need to kick us out." I stared at her and said softly, "I did not say I was evicting you, not yet." And that seemed to give her hope. She smiled a little and nodded. Good, let's calm down. We can fix this." But I held up a hand and I said not yet, but I meant what I said yesterday. The lease is binding, the violation is real. And if anything like that ever happens again, you will be served papers that same day. And I mean that with every breath in my body. They all looked stunned, not because I had threatened them, but because I had drawn a line. For the first time in my life I had said no and meant it. After that confrontation things became cold but quiet. My mother avoided me. Alicia stayed in her room. Chad came and went with that same smug expression, but no one crossed the line again, at least not openly. The days passed slowly, and I focused all my attention on work and my kids. I went back to attending meetings, volunteering at Zoe's school, helping Marcus with his science project. And slowly our rhythm returned. One night, about a week later, I was working late in my office when I heard footsteps outside the door. Hesitant, soft, not like the banging from before. I opened the door and saw my father standing there holding 2 mugs of tea. He looked older than I remembered, smaller, like time had shrunk him. I let him in, and he sat down without a word. For a while we just drank tea in silence. Then he said, "I never wanted this. I never wanted us to be on opposite sides." I looked at him and asked, "Then why did you let it happen? Why did you let Mom treat me like I was always wrong, like I was never enough?" He sighed deeply and said, "Because I was tired and ashamed. I failed to provide, and she filled that space with Control. It was easier to stay quiet than to fight her, but I see now that silence was the worst betrayal of all, and I am sorry. I nodded slowly, not sure if forgiveness was something I could give just yet, but I appreciated his honesty. It was more than I had expected from him. He left after that, and I sat alone for a long time thinking about all the times I had swallowed my pain to keep the peace, all the times I had said yes when I wanted to scream no. I realized something important that night, that boundaries are not walls, they are doors with locks, and I finally had the key. The next day, I bought new bedding for my kids, replaced their toys, bought them nightlights and small things to make them feel at home again. I also started looking for a new place to live, not because I was leaving, but because I was preparing for anything. I would not be caught off guard again. I would always have an exit plan. One evening, while we were watching a movie as a family, I noticed Alicia staring at us from the hallway, her face twisted in something like envy, maybe regret, I did not know, and I did not care because for the first time in a long time I was at peace even in that house full of ghosts. I had found a way to breathe again. A few days passed without drama, which should have made me feel better, but instead I stayed tense like a soldier waiting for the next ambush. My mother still kept her distance, pretending everything was normal, while Alicia walked around like she had been wronged, and Chad acted like the king of the house. But at least my kids were finally smiling again. Zoe started bringing home art projects from school, and Marcus had begun opening up more about his friends. I focused all my energy on them, on making their lives feel whole again, even inside a house where every corner still echoed with judgment and entitlement. One evening, while we were finishing up dinner, Alicia walked into the kitchen, and without looking at me, she asked, "Mom, can Leo have your bedroom for the night? He wants to set up his Lego city and needs more space." I blinked slowly, trying to register what she had just said, and my mother casually replied, "Sure, I am sleeping downstairs anyway." I stood up and said firmly, "No, that room belongs to my children. No one is taking it, not for a night, not for a minute." Alicia scoffed and rolled her eyes, and Chad, who had just walked in with a plate of food, chuckled and said, "Wow, someone woke up territorial today." I turned to him and said sharply, "This has nothing to do with territory and everything to do with respect. I will not let you play musical chairs with my kids' safe space just because you feel entitled to whatever you want." Alicia crossed her arms and said, "Well, maybe if your kid were not so spoiled and loud, we would not need space away from them." I stared at her for a moment, then said softly, "Your son throws food, your son breaks things, your son screams at adults, but my kids are spoiled, got it?" And I turned away before I said anything worse. Later that night, I overheard my mother and Alicia whispering in the kitchen, their voices low and harsh. Alicia said, "She is acting like she owns this place," and my mother replied, "She might think she does now that she has her precious lease." I stood quietly behind the hallway and listened to every word, and my stomach tightened with rage. I had sacrificed too much, given too much for them to still treat me like an outsider. The next day, I scheduled a full cleaning of the bedroom for Marcus and Zoe. I bought them a new bookshelf, and we spent the afternoon organizing their things together. I wanted them to feel grounded, not like they were in a temporary space again. As we worked, Zoe looked up at me and said softly, "Mama, why does Aunt Alicia not like us?" I paused, trying to find the right words, and finally said, "Some people hurt others because they are hurting themselves. It is not your fault, baby, and it never will be, but we are strong and we love each other, and that is all that matters." She nodded and hugged me tight, and I held her for a long moment. One evening 2 days later, Chad brought some friends over without telling anyone, and they started blasting music in the living room. I was in the middle of helping Marcus study, and the noise was shaking the walls. I walked out and asked Chad politely to lower the volume. He laughed and said, "What are you, the noise police?" Now I said, "This is still my house, and there are children here. They need peace." Chad sneered and said, "Maybe you should take your kids to a motel, then let adults enjoy themselves." I felt something in me snap, not out of anger, but out of certainty. I walked over to the main switchboard and flipped off the power to the living room. His music cut off mid-beat, and the entire group fell silent. I said, "Calm down or leave." Now they all looked stunned. Chad muttered something under his breath, and stomped out, slamming the door behind him that night. My mother refused to speak to me. Alicia stormed into her room and slammed the door, and Leo cried because his cartoons were interrupted, and I sat in my room with Zoe and Marcus watching a quiet movie with subtitles, and I realized how peaceful silence could be when it was earned the next morning. Alicia came downstairs while I was making pancakes, and she walked right up to me and said, "We need to talk." I turned and said, "I am listening." And she said, "You have made everyone miserable since you came back here. I do not know who you think you are, but you are not better than us. You just had a lucky job and a nice husband until he dumped you, and now you are taking your bitterness out on all of us." I stood very still, the spatula shaking slightly in my hand, and then I said, "I never thought I was better than you, Alicia, but I did think you were my sister, someone who would defend me when I was broken, someone who would welcome my children with kindness, not throw them out like trash. You do not have to like me, but you do have to respect the roof we are all under because I helped build it." Alicia snapped back, "Well, maybe you should leave if it bothers you so much. You act like we are living in your castle." I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "It is not a castle, it is a home, and I am not going anywhere. If anyone cannot live with boundaries, they can be the one to pack." I left the kitchen then, not because I was done, but because I knew nothing I said would reach her, and I had no more energy to waste on people who enjoyed conflict for sport. A few days later, my mother got a call from a family friend, and they invited her to a birthday dinner. She invited Alicia and Chad along, and when she asked if I wanted to come, I said no thank you politely. That night, while they were out, I put the kids to bed early and took a long bath. The house was finally silent, and I could think clearly. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and thought about everything that had happened all the years I had been the reliable one, the steady one, the one who never asked for much. I had been blamed for being too proud, when really I had just learned to stop begging for love. I decided to write down everything I felt. I opened my laptop and wrote a letter, not to anyone, but to myself, a letter that said, "You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to protect your peace." I saved it and cried, not because I was sad, but because I finally felt seen by myself. The next morning, Chad barged into the kitchen and said, "Did you mess with my car last night?" I blinked confused and said what he said. "My tire was flat this morning, and I know you are petty enough to do something like that." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I said, "You think I have time to sneak around in the dark and flatten tires?" He shouted, "I do not put it past you. You have been sabotaging everything since you got here." My mother rushed in trying to calm him, and I just raised my hands and said, "I am done. I will not argue anymore." I walked upstairs, packed my laptop, and took the kids out for the day. We went to the park, had ice cream, visited a bookstore, and watched a movie together in a tiny old theater. It was the most peace I had felt in weeks. When I returned home, Chad was gone. Alicia was sulking, and my mother avoided eye contact. But I did not care anymore because I had finally remembered who I was. Days moved along, but the mood inside the house stayed cold and bitter, as if every wall had learned to hold a grudge, and every chair waited to witness another silent war. Alicia kept pretending she was the victim. Chad moved like a shadow, only showing up to challenge or annoy, and my mother watched everything unfold with that same quiet judgment that she had worn like a second skin. Since the day I returned, I tried to focus on my kids. I really did. I helped Marcus with his science project, stayed up late painting his volcano red and gray, and made sure Zoe had all her colored pencils for animal posters. She was excited about every small thing I did for them, felt like a brick in the wall I was building between them and the bitterness that surrounded us. They needed to feel normal, even if the people around them refused to be. I started waking up earlier than anyone just to have 10 minutes of silence with my tea, and sometimes those 10 minutes were all that got me through the day. One afternoon, my mother called me into the living room, and I could tell by her tone that she was about to pretend to be reasonable. She patted the couch like I was a guest and said we needed to talk. I sat down, keeping my hands on my lap and my shoulders still, and she said, "I think this has gone on long enough. You and Alicia need to make peace. You are sisters, and I just want my family back." I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, "I agree, but peace cannot be one-sided. I have been insulted ignored and made to feel like a stranger in my own home. If Alicia wants peace, she can start by treating my children like family. My mother sighed and said she is under a lot of pressure. Chad is not always easy and Leo needs extra attention. I said my kids need love too. They are not noise, they are not clutter, and they should not be punished because someone else refuses to grow up. My mother shook her head and said you always think you are right, that is your problem. And I said no, I just know what my children deserve, and I will not apologize for protecting them. I stood up and left her sitting there, with her hands wringing her lap like I had just delivered a personal attack instead of a boundary. That same evening, Alicia made a grand show of setting the dining table with candles and flowers, and I knew she was up to something. She invited a couple of her friends over and acted like she was queen of some small forgotten country. She poured wine and made loud jokes, and at some point while I was walking through the room, she said loudly, "Some people only know how to clean and complain, they forget what joy feels like." I stopped for a second, and she smiled at me like a child who had just broken a plate on purpose. I said without turning to look at her, I would rather clean with dignity than laugh out of spite, and I kept walking. Later that night, Marcus came to me with tears in his eyes. He said Leo called him a charity case and said his mom could not keep a husband. I held him so tight, and I felt his small heart beating fast against mine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to take Leo's words and shove them back down his throat, but instead I said softly, "You are not a charity case, you are my miracle, and anyone who says otherwise does not know what real love looks like." He nodded, but I could see the crack forming, and that scared me more than anything. The next morning, I asked my mother if we could sit down and make some house rules, something to keep the peace. She looked at me like I had asked her to write a constitution, and said, "I am too old for rules. This is not a daycare." I said calmly, "It is not about age, it is about respect and structure for everyone, including you, including me." She stood up and said, "If you hate it here so much, then why stay?" I looked at her and said, "Because I will not let you push me out of a house I helped save. I will not let my kids be tossed aside again because it is inconvenient for you to grow." I walked out of the room and decided to take the kids out for a walk. We needed air, we needed the sky more than we needed that ceiling. Zoe picked wildflowers and Marcus skipped stones, and I watched them, and I remembered who I was. I was their safe place, their shelter, and I would never abandon that role no matter who tried to make me feel small. When we came back, there was a note on the fridge from Alicia. It said, "Family meeting at 7, do not be late." I laughed out loud because now she wanted structure, but I told the kids to stay in their room, and I sat on the couch as the clock hit 7. Alicia, Chad, and my mother sat across from me, and Alicia started by saying, "We have been talking, and we think it is best if you find another place to stay. You have changed the whole energy of this house." My mother nodded slowly, and Chad leaned back with that same smirk he always wore. I felt my fingers grip the cushion, but I did not move. I said, "This house belongs to me just as much as it does to you, and I have the lease to prove it. If you want to leave, that is your choice, but I am not going anywhere." Alicia said, "You are poisoning this home with your rules and your sadness." I said, "No, I am exposing what was already broken. Just because you hid it under fake smiles does not mean it was not there." My mother stood up and said, "I am tired. I cannot keep doing this." I said, "Then stop choosing chaos over clarity. Stop defending disrespect just because it is." Louder, I walked away before anyone could respond, and I went straight to my room, locked the door, and sat on the floor. I breathed slow and steady, and I told myself over and over, "I deserve peace, I deserve peace, I deserve peace." The next day, I took the kids to the library. We got books and sat by the window and drank warm cocoa. Zoe read her book about dolphins and Marcus read about space, and I watched them and thought maybe I could make a life beyond this house. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Maybe there was a way to build something new without dragging the old pain with me everywhere I went. That night as I was brushing Zoe's hair, she said, "Mama, do you think they will ever say sorry?" I paused and then said, "Maybe one day, but we do not need their sorry to be okay. We just need each other, and we are more than enough." She smiled and leaned against me, and I felt something in me settle like a storm, finally resting over calm water. The morning light filtered through the curtain, and instead of rushing to hide from it, I let it wash over me like a quiet reminder that I was still here, still standing, still fighting for my children. and for the life they deserved, I moved slowly out of bed, not because I was tired, but because I had learned that sometimes silence was a luxury, and I did not want to waste it. I made tea without a word, not even humming as the kettle heated, and I sat down to watch the steam curl upward like a small dance that belonged only to me. That moment of peace reminded me why I kept going through the chaos of a house that felt less and less like home with each passing day. The kids were still asleep, Zoe clutching her stuffed doll and Marcus curled up with a pillow hugged close to his chest. They looked peaceful, unaware of the weight I carried on my shoulders, but I did it all for them, and I would do it again 100 times over. Around mid-morning, I checked my email, something I rarely did these days because most of it was either bills or cold silence, but this time there was a message from Jasmine. The words were long, carefully written, like someone walking through broken glass barefoot. She apologized again, not just for taking Alicia's side, but for not listening, for dismissing, for vanishing when I needed her most. She said she had watched from a distance how my family treated me, and she was ashamed of her silence. She said she hoped one day I could forgive her, not to restore everything to how it was, but just enough so we could sit across from each other without shame. I read it once, then again, slower this time, not out of anger, but because some part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that she was not just another person using guilt as a performance tool. I closed my laptop and let the words sit with me like a stranger. At the edge of the bed, the kids woke up, and we had breakfast together, pancakes made from a mix and topped with jam. Marcus told a joke that made Zoe giggle so loud, even the walls seemed to smile for a moment. That moment was ours, pure and untouched. Later in the day, while folding laundry, I found one of Alicia's earrings under the couch, a small gold hoop she used to wear all the time, and I placed it quietly on the table, not as an offering, just as proof that even the things she left behind seemed to linger around me. I went to check the mailbox and found an envelope addressed to me from the housing office. Inside was a notice that someone had submitted a request for removal of a tenant. It listed Alicia as the complainant. I stared at the paper, trying to process the bold lines, the fake accusations, the twisting of reality. I took a deep breath and walked back inside. My mother was sitting on the couch watching a reality show, and I handed her the notice. She glanced at it, shrugged, and said, "Well, maybe it is time you found your own space. You are not a child anymore." I looked at her and said, "I am not a child, but I am your child, and you are letting your other daughter treat me like I am garbage." My mother turned off the television and stood up slowly and said, "I am tired of all this tension. You bring heaviness into this house." I said, "No, I bring truth. Alicia brings chaos." "And you let her?" She walked away without a word, and I stood there, feeling like a stranger holding proof that even paper could hurt when it was printed with lies. I called the housing office and explained everything, how my name was on the lease, how I had legal right to stay, how the complaint was false. And the woman on the line said calmly, "We will review paperwork and contact both parties within a few business days, but until then I suggest keeping things civil." I hung up and stared at the phone like it could undo the damage with a simple beep. That evening, Marcus asked if he could help cook, and I let him, even though he spilled flour everywhere. Zoe kept stealing carrots off the cutting board. We made spaghetti and garlic bread and ate it on the floor with a blanket like we were camping. Marcus said, "This is better than sitting at that table with mean faces," and I laughed and said maybe we should make this a tradition. We watched a cartoon movie, and when it ended, Zoe fell asleep in my lap, and Marcus leaned against me, and I thought maybe this was what safety looked like, not perfection, just softness. The next morning, Alicia came into the kitchen and saw us eating cereal. She looked at the bowls, then at me, and said, "You should start packing soon. The review won't go your way." I said calmly, "I am not leaving, Alicia." She smirked and said, "Then it will get messy." I said, "It already is, and I am done cleaning up after your messes." She stormed out, muttering something about lawyers and consequences, but I did not care, not any more. Later that day I got a call from a woman named Carla, someone I had met at a parent meeting back when Marcus was in 3rd grade. She said she had heard I was looking for part-time work and offered me a few shifts at her cafe. I thanked her and said I would come by to talk, and when I hung up, I felt something rise in me, something like breath after being underwater. I went to my room and started updating my resume, even though it had not been touched since 2010. Every word I typed felt like I was building a bridge back to myself. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I opened Jasmine's email again. And this time I replied I told her I appreciated her apology, and that trust was not a door that swung wide with one message but a path we could maybe walk slowly. She replied almost instantly, saying she understood and would wait however long it took even if it never came. And for the first time in a long while I did not feel completely alone the next morning. Alicia had left another note on the fridge, this time saying that she and Leo would be gone for a few days visiting Chad's family. I did not care why they were gone, only that they were gone, and for the first time in weeks the house felt open. The kids played music from the laptop, and we danced while making grilled cheese. Zoe wore a blanket like a cape, and Marcus used a spoon as a microphone. We laughed, and it echoed in the walls that usually held only tension. We stayed up late telling stories about silly things, and I let them fall asleep on the couch, and when I carried them to bed, I felt like I was carrying peace itself. I woke up that morning with a strange heaviness in my chest, as if my body had already sensed that something was coming before my mind could understand it. The kids were still asleep, tangled up in their blankets with the kind of peaceful expression that only children who have been truly exhausted can wear. I tiptoed into the kitchen, made a cup of tea, and tried to focus on the silence outside, but that calm was broken the moment I heard a knock at the door. It was sharp, forceful, not like the gentle tap of a neighbor or the lazy hand of a friend. When I opened it, there were two men standing there, one in a suit and the other in a uniform. The one in the suit introduced himself as a legal representative and handed me a folder with cold eyes and a flat voice. He said, "I have been asked to serve you these papers on behalf of the property owner." I asked what this was about, even though my heart already knew the answer. He said there had been a formal complaint submitted that I was living on the property without permission, and that I had 7 days to vacate or respond in writing. I stood there for a moment, not even blinking, as the words sank into me like ice water pouring through my bones. I looked down at the papers and saw Alicia's name on every line, the formal tone, the fake accusations, the carefully crafted lies. They were all hers. This was her revenge for standing up to her, for refusing to bow to her anymore. She wanted me gone from the house, from the family, from the life that I had worked so hard to rebuild. I closed the door slowly and walked into the kitchen where the kettle was still whistling. I turned it off and sat down at the table, the papers in front of me like a bomb waiting to explode. I stared at them for several minutes until the tears started falling silent and steady. I felt betrayed, not just by Alicia, but by my parents who had allowed her to take things this far, by their silence, by their complicity. I could hear movement in the hallway, and I wiped my face before the kids could see. Marcus rubbed his eyes and asked why I looked sad, and I forced a smile and said, "Just tired, baby. Go wash up for breakfast. We will eat soon." I made toast and scrambled eggs, even though my hands were shaking, and I forced myself to smile because they needed normalcy. They needed me to be strong even when the ground beneath us was cracking. After breakfast, I called the legal aid office and spoke to a woman named Evelyn, who sounded like she had dealt with 100 cases just like mine. I explained everything, and she asked me to send her a scanned copy of the notice. She said she would review it and get back to me as soon as possible. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I had done something, even if it was small, even if it felt like whispering in a hurricane. The rest of the day passed in a blur of distractions. I helped Marcus with a school project and played dolls with Zoe, who insisted her stuffed bunny needed a nap, and then a tea party, and then another nap. We colored and laughed, and I tried to pretend like I was not counting down the hours until Evelyn would call me back later that evening. She finally did, and her voice was calm but firm. She said, "You are still legally on the lease, and they cannot evict you without proper cause, but you will need to file a response within 5 business days or they can escalate." I asked her what I should do, and she said, "Come into the office tomorrow. We will go through it together and submit the documents officially. Bring anything you have that proves you contribute to the household or care for the children." I thanked her again, and after we hung up, I allowed myself to breathe. For the first time all day, it was not over, but at least I had a path forward. The next morning, I got the kids ready early, dropped them off at school, and took the bus downtown to the legal aid center. Evelyn was waiting for me with a stack of papers and a gentle nod. She went through everything page by page, showing me where to sign, what to include, and how to write my personal statement. I poured my heart into that letter, Every word was a truth that Alicia had tried to erase. I told them how I had lived there for years, helped raise Zoe, and Marcus kept the house running and paid for groceries and school supplies. I explained that Alicia only started this process after I refused to be silent, after I stood up to her lies. When it was done, Evelyn said this will help. It may not end things, but it will slow them down and give us a better chance. I thanked her again and walked out of the building feeling a strange mix of power and exhaustion. I picked up the kids from school and took them to the park, and for a few hours we just played. Zoe chased butterflies, and Marcus climbed the monkey bars, and I watched them thinking this is what I am fighting for, not just shelter but joy. After dinner, I saw Alicia sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. I said, "I got the papers," I responded, "and you are not going to get away with this." She looked up with that smirk I had come to hate and said, "You should have left quietly. Now it is going to be worse." I said, "I am not afraid of you, Alicia, and I am not going anywhere until someone forces me out legally." She shrugged and said, "Good luck with that. I have more money and better lawyers, and you have nothing." I said, "I have truth, and that is more than you have ever had." My mother came out of the kitchen and asked what was going on, and Alicia immediately started spinning her web of lies again, saying I was attacking her, that I was unstable, that I needed to leave for everyone's safety. I said, "That is not true, and you know it." She filed false papers and tried to kick me and my kids out, and you are still standing there saying nothing. My mother looked at me like I was a stranger and said, "Maybe it would be better if you found a new place for yourself and the kids. You need space." I stared at her for a long time and then nodded, not because I agreed, but because I finally understood she had made her choice, and it was not me. Later that night, I tucked the kids into bed and sat by the window listening to the wind outside. I felt like everything was slipping through my fingers, like I was drowning in quicks. And every time I fought back, the world just pressed harder. But I also knew I had come too far to give up now. I had stood in fire before, and I had not burned. I had been pushed down, and I had gotten back up, and I would do it again and again until my children had the peace they deserve. The day started with a bitter wind cutting through the cracks in the walls and windows, and I could feel the cold creeping into my bones even before I got out of bed. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before sitting up and placing my feet on the floor. The kids were still asleep, their breaths soft and steady like tiny waves lapping at a shore, and I let them rest while I made my way into the kitchen. I warmed some milk and sat at the table trying to gather my thoughts, but the truth was that my mind had not stopped racing since I got that eviction notice. Every minute since then had felt like a slow fall into something I could not control. That morning I called Evelyn again just to check on the progress, and she told me she had submitted everything, and the other party had been served with a counterstatement. The ball was in their court now, and we would wait for the court hearing date. She said she would keep me updated and to stay calm as much as I could. I thanked her and hung up, and just as I did, Alicia walked into the room wearing her usual robe and holding a mug like she had just come back from a spa week. And she looked at me and said, "Oh, you are still here. I thought you would be packing by now." I didn't respond at first. I just stood up and poured the kids cereal as calmly as I could. But she would not stop. She leaned against the counter and said, "You know you are going to lose, right? You are wasting your time and dragging those poor kids through this." For what I turned her and said, "I am not going to lose because I am not lying," and deep down you know that she laughed and said, "You are so dramatic, like you are in some movie or something. This is real life, honey. And in real life people like me win." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw that mug across the room, but I didn't. Instead, I picked up the cereal bowls and walked back to the kids' room and gently woke them up. "It's time for breakfast, loves. Come eat before it gets soggy." They sat at the table and ate while I watched them with a tight smile on my face. Marcus asked if we were going to the park after school, and I said maybe, if the weather stays nice. Zoe asked if we could get hot chocolate too, and I nodded. Anything to keep their hearts light, even for a while after they left for school. I stayed home to clean and do laundry, but my head was a storm. I kept thinking about all the years I spent building trust with my parents, with Alicia, all the things I had forgiven, all the moments I had swallowed my pride just to keep peace in the family. And now I was the villain in their eyes, and she was the golden one, the perfect daughter, the untouchable one. Around noon my mother called and asked me to come to the main house. I walked over, unsure of what to expect, but I kept my chin up when I entered the living room. My father was there too, sitting with arms crossed like he had already judged me. My mother said, "We need to talk about this situation. It's getting out of hand." I said, "I agree, so why am I the one being threatened with eviction?" She said, "You know, we never wanted this. We just want peace." Alicia says, "You have been aggressive and unstable, and the kids are scared." I laughed without humor and said, "Do they look scared to you every day? They come to me smiling and laughing because they feel safe, not because they are afraid." My father said, "Maybe it's time you moved on. You are a grown woman, and it's not right for you to stay here forever. You have to build something for yourself." I said I had something. I had a home and support and family, and it was all ripped away because Alicia could not stand not being the center of attention for once. My mother said, "We think it's best if you find another place. We can help you with the deposit if you want." I stared at them both and said, "So that's it. I stand up for myself and my kids, and now I am the problem." They did not respond, and I knew in that silence that they had already chosen sides. Alicia must have planned this all so perfectly, building her story, planting her lies, getting them to see me through her eyes, not their own. I stood up and said, "Thank you for the offer, but I will fight this to the end." I walked out of that house feeling like a stranger on land I used to call home. That night, I stayed up reading documents Evelyn had sent me about similar cases. I highlighted notes, took screenshots, made copies. I wanted to be prepared if I had to stand in front of a judge. I wanted every word I spoke to be sharp and clear. The kids were asleep, but I felt their presence around me like a warmth I could not lose. The next day, I took them to school and went straight to Evelyn's office. She smiled when she saw me and said, "Good, you are ready." She walked me through the hearing process, told me what to expect and how to respond. She said, "The judge will look at your documentation and hear both sides, and we must stay factual and calm no matter what the other side says." I nodded and took notes and listened with every ounce of focus I had. I was not just defending my place to live. I was defending my dignity, my children's safety, our right to exist without being trampled by someone's ego. After the meeting, I picked up the kids early and took them for ice cream. We sat on a bench and laughed, and they told me stories from school. Zoe had made a new friend and Marcus had scored the highest in math. And as I listened, I felt a spark of hope. No matter what happened in that courtroom, I had already won in some way because they were okay. They were still whole. That night, Alicia came home with bags of shopping, and her friend, some woman with a voice like nails on a chalkboard. They laughed and drank wine while I sat in my room reading the statement I was going to present to the judge. I wrote and rewrote it a dozen times. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted it to be true, not just in facts, but in feeling. I poured in everything: the years of silence, the times I put others first, the nights I stayed up caring for her child when she partied, the meals I cooked, birthdays I planned, the sacrifices I made even when no one saw. I ended it by saying, "I may not have wealth or power, but I have truth, and I believe that still counts for something." I printed it, folded it, and placed it in my file. The kids were asleep, and I kissed them on the forehead and whispered, "I will protect you always, even when the world tries to tell me I can't, even when it's hard, even when it breaks me. I will not give up." The wind howled outside, but in that moment I felt unshaken because I knew the storm was about to come, and I was ready. I stood in the kitchen with the sound of the refrigerator humming behind me as I tried to steady my hands long enough to pour myself a glass of water, but even the simple act of holding a cup felt too heavy with everything that had happened swirling inside me like a storm refusing to pass, and my mind was stuck in loops of questions and what-ifs and regrets and anger that wouldn't dissolve no matter how many times I tried to distract myself. And I remembered the moment when I stood on the porch of my parents' house, watching them close the door behind my kids, as if they were nothing more than guests who had overstayed their welcome, as if their own blood had become a nuisance in the face of the golden grandchild, who seemed to hold more weight, more value, more everything in their eyes. And that memory lived in my bones, now carved into every breath and heartbeat and step I took. And it haunted me not because of what they did, but because of how easy it was for them to do it, how effortlessly they discarded the children who had loved them and looked up to them and considered their home a safe place, and the betrayal wasn't just toward me, but toward those two young souls who had once drawn crayon hearts for their grandparents, who had saved cookies to share with them, who had learned songs just to sing in their living room, hoping for a smile. And now those same children sat in their rooms quiet and unsure, not asking questions anymore, because they already knew the answers, and it was in the silence that I realized just how deep the damage had gone, because my son, who once filled the house with questions and jokes, barely spoke, and my daughter, who once painted the world with laughter, now walked with shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself small enough to disappear, and I hated what had been done to them more than anything that had been done to me, and I replayed every conversation, every argument, every justification my parents gave for their actions, and none of it made sense, no matter how they tried to package it in the name of fairness or balance or misunderstanding. Because the truth was they made a choice, and that choice was not us, and as much as I wanted to believe they were confused or misguided, the consistency of their actions told another story, a story where they knew exactly what they were doing and simply did not care. And the worst part was watching my children still hope for a call, a text, a message that never came, and seeing them still glance at the mailbox or check my phone screen when it lit up, hoping it might be their grandparents changing their minds. But it never was, and each day that passed without that call etched another line of disappointment into their hearts, and I tried to fill the void with hugs and outings and bedtime stories and pancakes with extra syrup. But even the sweetest things tasted hollow when served next to abandonment, and I began to wonder if I had failed them by trusting people who had already shown me who they were. But even in that guilt, I reminded myself that I had believed in second chances and healing, and the idea that love could win, and maybe that made me naive, but it also made me human. And I looked at my children and decided that even if the world turned cold around them, I would be the warmth that never left. I would be the voice that never turned sharp or silent. I would be the arms that never closed the door. And I poured that promise into every small thing, from the way I folded their clothes to the way I listened without rushing. And I knew I couldn't erase the pain, but I could be the one who stayed, and slowly I started to rebuild a new kind of safety for us, not one built on the fragile hope that others would do the right thing, but one grounded in our own strength and our love and our laughter, even if it took time for those things to feel real again. And then came the weekend visit with their cousin, the golden child, the one who unknowingly had become the center of a war he never started, and I prepared myself for the wave of emotions that might come. But what I wasn't prepared for was how my children responded with grace and kindness and a patience that felt bigger than their years. And as they played and shared and laughed, something inside me softened, because despite everything they had not become bitter or cruel or closed off. They had not turned into mirrors of the people who hurt them, and instead they carried a quiet courage that I could only admire and learn from. And I saw how my daughter gave her cousin the better seat, and how my son offered him the last cookie, and I realized they were teaching me about forgiveness, not the kind that excuses the past, but the kind that refuses to carry its poison forward. And I watched them make room in their hearts, not for the people who hurt them, but for the joy that still existed beyond that hurt. And that night after their cousin left, I sat beside them and asked how they felt, and my daughter said simply, "It was nice," and my son said, "I hope he doesn't feel bad for what happened." And in those words I saw their strength and their empathy and their resilience, and I knew that while the world had been unfair to them, they were choosing not to be unfair in return. And it was then that I understood something important, that while I had been focused on protecting them from pain, they had already found their own way through it, and they were not broken, they were becoming. And it made me rethink everything about the way I viewed healing and justice and closure, because maybe it wasn't about waiting for apologies or making others see the damage they caused. Maybe it was about choosing to keep going, choosing to love anyway, choosing to laugh again and again and again, even when it hurt. And I tucked them into bed and whispered that I was proud of them, not just for how they handled that visit, but for how they had held onto their hearts in a world that tried to make them hard. And I promised them again that I would never stop showing up and never stop fighting for the love they deserved. And as I closed their door, I felt something shift in me, not a dramatic change, but a steady decision to build a future where they never had to question their worth again. And it started with how I spoke to them, how I showed up, how I modeled boundaries and kindness and strength. And I sat down that night and began to write a letter, not to my parents but to myself, a letter reminding me of everything we had survived and everything we were still becoming. And in that letter I wrote that even though we had been pushed aside, we were not lost, and even though we had been hurt, we were not ruined, and even though we had been treated as less, we were always enough. And as I sealed that letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, I felt a calmness I hadn't felt in months, because I knew that we were no longer waiting to be seen or chosen or validated. We were already choosing each other, and that was more than enough. The next few days passed like a strange storm where silence was louder than anything anyone said, and even though no one in the house dared to bring up what had happened at the family meeting that ended in shouting, tears, and doors slamming, the energy in the air was like walking through broken glass. I went about my chores, my parenting, and my work like I always did, but every single step felt heavier, because now I was carrying the weight of knowing exactly how my parents viewed my children, not as blessings, not as part of their legacy, but as expendable problems standing in the way of the fantasy family. And still part of me hoped maybe my mother would call, maybe my father would text, maybe someone would knock on my door and say it was all a big misunderstanding. But the knock never came, and the phone stayed cold and silent. And eventually I realized they were serious. They had picked their side, and it was not mine at first. My kids were confused, asking why Grandma and Grandpa were not coming over like they used to, and why we were not invited to the weekend brunches anymore. I tried to shield them from the truth, telling them my parents were busy or out of town. But kids are smarter than we give them credit for, and soon my oldest looked me in the eyes and asked if they were not good enough for Grandma and Grandpa, and I had no answer that would not break her heart, so I hugged her tightly and promised her that she was more than enough, that she was everything. But deep down I knew that damage had already been done, and it hurt me more than anything else ever had I watched from afar as my sister paraded her golden child around in matching outfits for holiday photo shoots and choreographed birthday parties with rented ponies and themed cakes, while my parents stood proudly beside her like royalty in a court that had banished my side of the bloodline. And I tried not to let the envy burn, but it did, because I was not envious of the gifts or the parties or the attention. I was angry that my kids were denied the kind of love that should have been unconditional, the kind of love that should never have come with terms and conditions or popularity contests. And one day I received a wedding invitation from a distant cousin, and I noticed my name was not listed under family guests. Instead, it was written as friend of the bride, which was odd, since I had grown up with the groom, played hide and seek with him every summer, and my kids used to call him uncle. I later found out from an aunt that my sister had told everyone I was estranged from the family by choice, and that I preferred to be left alone, and that was the moment it clicked. They were rewriting the story. They were painting me as the black sheep, the rebel, the one who walked away, not the one who was pushed out. And I felt this rage build inside me, not the kind that screams or breaks things, but the cold, quiet kind that stays and simmers and makes you determined to never be silenced again. Around that time I got a call from my cousin who had not spoken to me in years, and at first I thought maybe she was reaching out to reconnect, but her voice was casual and fake, asking how I was doing, then slipping into questions about whether I had forgiven my parents yet, because everyone missed me at the last barbecue, and they hoped I would come to the next one. And I realized she was not calling for me. She was calling as a messenger to report back to the family whether or not I had softened, and I told her calmly that I had not changed my mind, and if they truly missed me, they could talk to me themselves, not send scouts. And when I hung up, I felt strangely free, like I had stopped waiting for something that was never going to come. I focused on building a new kind of life for my kids, one where our family might be smaller, but our love was stronger. I took them on local adventures. We built backyard forts, made pancakes for dinner and laughed until midnight, and I made sure they knew every single day that they were wanted, that they were seen, that they mattered, and that they never had to earn my love with grades, medals, or obedience. And slowly I saw their smiles grow again, their shoulders relax, their return, and one night my daughter asked me if I missed Grandma and Grandpa, and I paused before answering, and said I missed who I thought they were, and she nodded like she understood more than she should, and hugged me, and said that maybe we could just be enough for each other, and that made my eyes water more than I expected, and I realized something profound. Sometimes blood does not mean loyalty, and sometimes family is not who raised you or who shares your DNA, but who shows up, who stays, who fights for you even when it is not easy. And as the months passed, the calls from my parents became less, eventually stopping completely, and I deleted their numbers not out of hatred but out of acceptance, and I stopped checking their social media, stopped asking mutual relatives for updates, stopped trying to prove anything, and instead I lived, and that was my quiet rebellion, my defiance, not in shouting or dragging anyone through the mud, but in choosing peace, in choosing love, in choosing my children every single day without apology or regret. And I started to write again, something I had not done since before I became a mother. Stories, poems, little essays about resilience, about healing, about finding light in the cracks. And slowly my voice came back, not the voice I had when I was younger and desperate to please, but a new voice, strong, rooted, grounded. And I shared one of those pieces on a parenting blog, and it got shared thousands of times. Strangers wrote to me saying they felt seen, understood, less alone, and that meant more than any apology ever could. And I realized I had turned my pain into purpose, and maybe that was the point all along. Maybe the fire was never meant to destroy me, but to forge me into something new, something brave, something honest. And on the anniversary of the day my parents kicked my children out, I did not cry, I did not rage. I lit a candle and made dinner with my kids, and we toasted to new beginnings, to chosen family, to the kind of love that does not play favorites and does not disappear when things get hard. And in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be, not in their house, not in their approval, not in their carefully curated golden child fantasy, but in my own truth, with my own people, in a home built not on judgment, but on joy, and that was more than enough for me. The morning after that quiet dinner with my kids, I woke up feeling something I had not felt in a long time, not anger, not sadness, not bitterness, but calm, the kind of calm that only comes when you have nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. I opened the window and let the cold breeze hit my face. It stung, but it also reminded me that I was still alive and still standing despite everything. I made tea, slowly savoring the silence instead of filling it with distractions, and I watched the steam rise like a small symbol of all the pain that had evaporated over the past year. And as I sat there, I thought about how far I had come from the woman who once begged for approval, who once cried herself to sleep over being left out, who once believed she had to earn her place in her own family. I thought about how I had raised my children through chaos, through rejection, through heartbreak, and somehow they had not only survived but thrived. They were kinder, more empathetic, more resilient than many adults I knew. And that was not an accident. That was love, real love, not the conditional kind my parents gave, but the kind that held steady through storms and silence, the kind that never wavered. When it was tested, I took my kids to school that morning and kissed their foreheads like I always did, but this time I looked them in the eyes and said, "You are my greatest joy, and I am proud of you." And they smiled in that way children do when they feel truly seen, and it hit me again like a soft punch to the heart. This is what family is supposed to be, not grand gestures or picture-perfect holidays, but small daily moments of truth and tenderness. I spent that day cleaning the house, not because anyone was coming over, but because I wanted our space to feel good for us. And as I folded laundry and swept floors, I replayed all the times I had bent myself into 1,000 shapes, trying to be enough for people who had already decided I never would be. I remembered the birthdays where my kids' names were skipped during toasts, the Christmas dinners where their gifts were last-minute afterthoughts, the graduation where no one showed up for my son, even though he invited them months in advance, and I realized how long I had let that kind of treatment slide, calling it tradition or personality, or just how they are, and I vowed never to do that again, never to let anyone treat my Children like they were background characters in their own story, never to let anyone treat me like I was lucky to be tolerated. And I started writing letters not to send, but to release everything I had wanted to say to my mother, to my father, to my sister, to the cousins who turned their backs to the aunt who said blood is thicker than water, as if that justifies abuse, and I poured out the truth, no filters, no sugar coating. And when I was done, I burned them one by one and watched the flames carry those words away. And I felt lighter, not healed, but on my way to healing. And that night I made a playlist of all the songs that once comforted me, songs from childhood, songs from breakups, songs from late night drives where tears blurred the traffic lights. And I danced with my kids in the living room, not caring how silly I looked. And for the first time in years, I felt joy, not performative, not borrowed, not fragile, but joy that came from knowing I had protected my peace and my children and my truth. And a week later, I received an email from my sister. It was short, cold, and laced with fake kindness. She said she hoped I was well, and that the family would love to reconnect if I was ready, that it would be nice for the cousins to grow up knowing each other. And I stared at that message for a long time, trying to decide whether to reply, trying to decipher if this was a real olive branch or just a social performance. And in the end, I chose silence, not because I was angry, but because I was done explaining myself to people who had never cared to understand me in the first place. And I blocked her email address not out of spite, but to protect my peace. And a few days later, a mutual friend told me my parents had been asking around about me again, that they were telling people they missed me, that they hoped I would come around, that family was too important to let go. And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd how they still did not get it, how they still believed that time alone could erase the choices they made, how they still thought the blame could be smudged. Until it disappeared, I did not miss the family I missed the family I imagined I had, and that was a painful truth to sit with, but it was also freeing, because now I could stop trying to fix what was never whole to begin with, and instead focus on what I was building, what I had already built, a life of honesty, of love, of hard-earned joy. And that weekend my daughter had a school play. She was nervous at first, worried that no one would come, but when she looked into the audience and saw me standing in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else, her eyes lit up, and in that moment I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. No more chasing invitations to places where I was never truly wanted, no more begging for scraps of love from people who only valued loyalty when it served them. I had chosen myself, I had chosen my kids, I had chosen a future that did not require anyone else's approval, and that was more than enough, because sometimes the greatest revenge is not screaming or exposing or dragging people through the mud. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living well and fully and loudly in the face of those who tried to silence you. And that is what I intended to do every single day from that point forward, to show my children that walking away from pain is not weakness, it is wisdom, and that building something beautiful from broken pieces is not naive, it is brave. And as I tucked them in that night, and they thanked me for being the best mom in the world, I smiled, because I knew I had not just survived the storm, I had learned to dance in the rain. The days that followed were thick with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the sort that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I woke up early that morning, and for a while just sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, and trying to summon the strength to move. It had been exactly 2 weeks since my parents kicked my children out, and every day since then had felt like a long struggle through mud. But today was different. Today was the day I finally decided I was not going to sit quietly anymore. I went to the kitchen, made myself a strong cup of black tea, and sat at the table going over everything again in my head, the betrayal, the favoritism, the way they treated my children like they were nothing compared to their so-called golden grandchild. I could still hear my mother's voice echoing in my ears when she said, maybe it's better this way, maybe your children need learn some humility. And I remembered how my son's face crumpled when he heard that, and how my daughter stopped talking for 2 days after they were thrown out. It was more than just a bad choice on my parents' part. It was a deep and deliberate act of emotional cruelty, and I finally saw it for what it was. I had been raised in a house where my sister could do no wrong, and I could never do anything right, and I'd carried that weight for years, quietly hoping that one day they would see me and my children for who we really were, but it was never going to happen unless I stood up and made them see. I dressed slowly that morning, putting on my most serious black blouse and my dark jeans, tying my hair into a bun the way I always did when I meant business. My kids were still asleep on the fold-out couch in the living room, and I kissed each of them on the forehead before I left, promising them silently that this time I would not return defeated. I drove to my parents' house, the same house I had grown up in, the same driveway I had played in as a child, and I parked there for a few minutes just staring at the door that once felt like home, but now felt like a wall. I rang the bell, and it was my father who opened the door. His face dropped the second he saw me, and he stepped aside without a word. My mother was in the kitchen, and my sister was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. I stood in the middle of the living room and cleared my throat loud enough to make them all look up. I told them I had come for the truth, not their excuses or their twisted version of events, but the real truth. I asked my father how he could throw out two children who had done nothing wrong. I asked my mother how she could turn her back on her own grandchildren. And I asked my sister how she could sit there in silence while her son mocked and bullied mine without ever lifting a finger. They all looked uncomfortable, but it was my mother who finally spoke. She said they had to make a choice, and they chose stability, meaning they chose my sister's perfect life, over mine, meaning they chose to protect the peace in their house instead of the pain in mine. I told them that I understood now, that I finally saw everything clearly. I told them I was done begging for love that came with conditions and rules and silent punishments, and that from this moment on I was reclaiming my voice, my time, my pride. I told them that they would no longer see my children as an afterthought, because we were not the backup family. We were not the ones you keep around for convenience or guilt. We were real people with real hearts, and we were done being treated like disposable clutter. I left the house without another word, and as I drove away, I felt something lift off my shoulders, something that had been there for decades, something heavy and old and sharp. I went straight to the small bakery near our apartment and ordered the biggest chocolate cake they had. I picked out some balloons and party hats and went home to celebrate my daughter's birthday properly, the one that had been ruined by my parents and my sister and that horrible golden child. We spent the whole evening laughing and eating cake with icing on our faces and crumbs in our hair, and for the first time in a long time I looked at my kids and saw joy, not just survival, not just holding on, but actual pure joy. And I made myself a promise that night. I promised that no matter how hard things got, I would never again let anyone treat my kids like they were less than. I would never again stay quiet just to keep the peace. I would never again wait around for people who made me feel small. I tucked them into bed and whispered that I loved them louder than I ever had, and I meant every word. And as I turned off the lights and stood in the doorway watching them sleep, I felt proud not just of them, but of myself, because I had finally chosen us. I had finally chosen what was right instead of what was expected, and that choice changed everything. And in that moment I realized that even though my parents kicked my kids out, even though they picked their golden grandchild over us, they did not know that by doing that they gave me the fire to fight back, the strength to walk away, and the clarity to never let them hurt us again. The next morning came with a strange kind of calm, the sort of stillness that settles in after a storm, not because the chaos is over, but because you are no longer afraid of it. I opened my eyes slowly, listening to the faint hum of the city waking up outside the window, and for once there was no heaviness in my chest, no dread weighing me down, just a quiet kind of strength rising from somewhere deep inside. I moved around the apartment with deliberate purpose, brushing my teeth, fixing breakfast, and checking on the kids who were still snuggled up under their blanket. It's their faces, peaceful and untouched by the burdens I had carried for so long. It hit me again, as it had a few times before, that everything I was doing now was for them, not just to protect them, but to teach them, to show them what it looked like to stand your ground, to walk away when love becomes a weapon, to choose self-respect even when it means walking alone. I sat at the small table by the window, sipping my tea and staring at the empty chair across from me, where my mother once sat during her rare visits before everything fell apart. She used to bring over her little tins of homemade sweets and talk about how proud she was of my sister and all the achievements her grandson had racked up in school. There was never space for my stories for my children's milestones, unless they somehow benefited her pride, and I realized I had been holding on to those crumbs for years, thinking that maybe, if I was good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, she would see me the way she saw my sister. But that never happened, and it never would, and I finally understood that it was not my fault, and it was not my children's fault either. So I took out my old worn notebook, the one I used to write in before life got too heavy, began writing down everything that happened from the day they were kicked out to the night we celebrated with cake and laughter. It was not about revenge or documentation, it was about memory, about truth. I wanted my kids to know the full story, someday, not the twisted version that would no doubt circulate through the family gossip chain, but the real, raw, honest truth of what happened and how we survived it. I poured my heart into every word, my hand shaking with emotion, but steady with purpose. By mid-day, I had written 10 pages, and I felt lighter, as if letting the truth breathe had created space in me for something new, something better. I closed the notebook and went into the kitchen to prepare lunch. As I was chopping vegetables, my phone buzzed, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but something told me to check it, and when I did, I saw a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of my son's jacket lying crumpled in my parents' driveway, with a caption that read, "You forgot something." It was clearly from my sister. I knew her pettiness too well to mistake it, and for a brief second rage threatened to consume me, but then I smiled, because I knew this was desperation. This was her trying to pull me back into their web of manipulation, and I refused to bite. I deleted the message, blocked the number, and went back to chopping carrots with more focus than ever. My children would not see me spiral, not again, not over people who never deserved our tears. Later that evening, I took the kids out to the park, and we spent hours just walking, running, and sitting by the fount. And my daughter told me she wanted to be a lawyer someday, and my son said he wanted to build his own house with a secret slide, and I told them they could be anything and do anything because they were brilliant and brave and kind, and no matter what anyone said, they were enough. The sky turned orange and pink as the sun dipped behind the buildings, and in that golden hour I saw something in their eyes that I had not seen in weeks. Freedom. I took a photo of them laughing together to remind myself that joy was still possible even after heartbreak. When we got home, there was a note taped to our door. It was from our neighbor, Mrs. Patel, offering to babysit the kids anytime I needed a break. She said she admired my strength and the way I protected my children, and that note made me cry, not because I was sad, but because for the first time in a long time someone saw me, someone appreciated me without expecting me to shrink or bend to fit their version of me. I put the note in the notebook with all the pages I had written earlier, because that too was part of our story, the kindness of strangers that helped heal what family had broken. As the kids settled into bed, I sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker to life, and I thought about what came next, not just surviving but building a life on our terms, a life with boundaries and honesty and love that did not require sacrifice of self. I knew it would not be easy. Money was tight, and the road ahead was uncertain, but we had each other, and that was more than enough. I got a call the next day from an old friend who heard what happened and offered me a part-time job at her boutique, helping with inventory and customer service. It was not glamorous, and the pay was modest, but it was a start, and I said yes without hesitation, because I was ready to rebuild brick by brick. I went in for my first shift 2 days later, wearing a second-hand blazer and a renewed sense of purpose, and by the end of the day my feet were sore, but my heart was full. I had spent hours folding clothes, chatting with customers, and learning the system, and for once I felt capable again, not just as a mother, but as a woman standing on her own. I picked up the kids after school, and we celebrated with ice cream and loud music in the car, dancing like fools at red lights and singing along to every song we knew. And I thought to myself, this is what healing looks like. It is messy and slow and full of small victories that most people overlook, but for us, every smile, every kind word, every quiet moment was a step towards something better. And I promised myself I would keep walking, no matter how long the road. I would walk for my children, for myself, for the girl I used to be. and the woman I was becoming, and I knew with every fiber of my being that we were going to be just fine because we had already survived the worst and we came out stronger. The following weeks unfolded like pages of a book. I had been too scared to read before, filled with equal parts fear, hope, anger, and relief, and yet every chapter pushed me forward no matter how slowly. I began waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to reclaim my mornings, my life, my time while the kids slept peacefully. I would sit by the window, write in my notebook, and watch the sky shift from soft gray to warm gold. And every new sunrise reminded me that darkness never wins if you just keep going. Some days were hard. There were mornings when I would break down in the shower, silent sobs shaking my body, but I always reminded myself that I was not broken, I was rebuilding, and that kind of work takes more strength than anyone who has never had to do it can ever understand. I started budgeting better, learning how to stretch every rupee without feeling shame about it. I learned how to make pancakes that my kids actually liked, how to fix a leaking tap with a YouTube tutorial, how to say no when someone tried to cross a line I had drawn in the sand. Even if that someone was family, I ignored the missed calls from my parents and the texts from distant relatives. Suddenly had opinions about my life as if they had not been silent spectators when everything fell apart. I knew most of them had been fed some twisted version of the story, maybe that I had overreacted or disrespected the elders or poisoned my kids against their grandparents, but I had stopped caring about approval from people who never truly saw me in the first place. I started putting up art my daughter made on the walls of our small apartment. I bought a cheap second-hand lamp that gave the living room a warm glow at night, and I let music play in the background all day. Not sad music, not angry music, but songs that made us dance even if we were tired. I took the kids to the bookstore one weekend and let them pick out anything they wanted, and the way their eyes lit up made my heart swell. I even got myself a novel, something light, something romantic, just to remind myself that I still had the capacity for joy and softness and dreams. I reconnected with a college friend who was now a single mother too, and we would meet every Saturday at the park watching our kids play while we shared stories that were both painful and hilarious, and that friendship became a kind of lifeline, a reminder that I was not alone, that other women had clawed their way out of the same pits and made lives worth living, worth loving. Then one day, as I was leaving work, my boss pulled me aside and told me she wanted to promote me to a full-time position with a slight pay raise. She said she had noticed my dedication and the way customers responded to me, and I almost cried right there in the storage room surrounded by boxes and coat hangers. But instead I smiled, nodded, and thanked her. And when I told the kids later that night, they cheered like I had just won a trophy. It meant stability. It meant I could finally start saving a little. It meant we could breathe easier and dreaming bigger. I remember walking to the balcony that night, looking up at the stars and whispering, thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe, or maybe to the version of me who had not given up when it would have been so easy to. I knew things were not perfect and probably never would be, but they were honest and ours, and that made them beautiful. My daughter started writing poems inspired by our journey, and my son became obsessed with building things from recycled materials, saying he would one day make a house for all kids who needed one. And I realized that even though they had been hurt, even though they had seen the ugliness of betrayal and favoritism, they were healing. They were becoming empathetic, thoughtful, resilient, and that was the greatest victory I could ask for. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. It had no return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from my mother. She wrote that she missed the children, and that she hoped I could find it in my heart to let them visit her just for a week. And she claimed she had changed, that she had realized her mistake and wanted to make amends. And for a long time I sat with that letter, reading it over and over, trying to hear the truth between the lines. I asked myself if she deserved another chance, if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. But deep down, I knew the answer. I had learned that forgiveness is not the same as access, that you can forgive someone and still choose to protect yourself and your children from further harm. So I wrote back a short but firm letter telling her that while I appreciated her reaching out, our family was no longer open to relationships that were conditional, manipulative, or disrespectful. I told her that healing was not a revolving door, and that we were finally at peace and intended to stay that way. I dropped it in the mailbox with a clear conscience, and that night I slept better than I had in months, not because she was out of our lives, but because I had finally let go of the idea that I needed her validation to be whole. We planned a small picnic the next weekend, just the three of us, in a quiet green park with a lake and old trees, and we sat on a worn blanket eating sandwiches and talking about everything and nothing, and I looked at my children and realized we had created something sacred, something no one could take from us. We had created a home built not from bricks and money, but from honesty, laughter, and love, and I promised myself that I would keep showing up for them, and for myself every single day, no matter how tired, no matter how scared, no matter what. And when my daughter leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I love our little life, Mom," I knew I had done something right. I knew that despite everything we had been through, the wounds, the lies, the betrayal, we had won, not because we had hurt anyone back, but because we had refused to be broken. We had chosen light over darkness, truth over silence, and love over fear. And that choice would carry us forward into every tomorrow, stronger than ever before. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.